Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I apologize profusely for the delay. We have had some technical issues with this panel that we have not had with any other panel at this entire conference. But thanks so much for those of you who decided to wait it out. My name is Jake Lillian. I am an attorney here at NCRC, and I am the manager of NCRC's compliance program. I am the organizer of the panel, and it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Stella Adams. Stella is a legend in the fair housing world, and she hired me here at NCRC almost 5 years ago to the day when she was our chief of equity and inclusion. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stella. Take it away.
Thank you so very much. This is going to be an amazing panel. I'm going to let us get right to it. We are going to hear from a young man with the National Fair Housing Alliance, Morgan Williams, and he's going to really talk about the future of fair housing from a unique perspective, and the perspective that we all have in what's life going to look like post-COVID. And he has some insights that he wants to share with us, not only about the vision of that future, but how we can engage in that future. And with that introduction, I'm going to ask Morgan Williams if he will speak and tell us and talk to us about his piece of the panel.
Thank you, Stella, and thank you, everyone, for sticking with us in regards to the technical issues. Obviously, we're in the midst of the pandemic, and it has potentially changed with the prevalence and distribution of vaccines here in the U.S., but it will be with us for some time. And it's at this time, been going on for over a year, and as we sit with how it has affected us and changed us as people and as advocates, it's helpful to potentially contemplate the way in which this change has presented an opportunity to expand fair housing advocacy. No doubt the pandemic presents a different frame to pursue our advocacy, but the fights remain. And I'm just going to very briefly, given our, I think, truncated time, list 4 ways in which I think the pandemic has potentially changed perspectives in ways that we may want to try to seize upon. And the first is that with the essential worker, there is a greater appreciation of the low-income worker. There's a lot of stereotypes that accompany poverty, and the pandemic has served to change some of those. And with that, there's the potential for a shift in paradigm regards to the housing choice voucher program from an operation of scarcity. There are long wait lists across regions to paradigm of universal access for any household that is eligible. And with that shift comes the need for corresponding source of income protections. And there is a current push at the federal level to advance national source of income protections. Unfortunately, it is a fraught issue, and its success depends upon the way that the infrastructure package moves forward. But on this issue, there's still great opportunity for expanding state and local protections, and there's great opportunity for HUD to exert its authority through guidance and enforcement. Secondly, with the devastation that COVID brought disproportionately to the Black and Latino communities, there's a greater understanding of the link between systemic racism and health disparities. And with that, there's an opportunity for fair housing advocates to link community health assessments and whatever planning process, fair housing planning process, emerges under the new assessment of fair housing AFFH regime. I will post just a link here to information on the CDC's website about community health assessments, but we're advancing the idea that communities should engage in these planning processes, which take place every 3 to 5 years, concurrent with their fair housing planning, to understand and explore not only the depth to which systemic racism impacts health disparities and health disparities perpetuate systemic racism, but how to uncrack that problem at a local level. Third thing that has emerged from the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement in the course of the pandemic is a greater understanding the link between the history of slavery and modern day racial wealth inequity. This presents a greater opportunity for potential race-conscious housing programs. The Small Business Administration's regulatory scheme could be a model for such housing programs. And the first thing that scheme is predicated upon is voluminous findings on the history of discrimination in the relevant industry and continuing disparities. The assessment of fair housing process as it emerges is that at the local level. And it presents an opportunity not only to identify priorities that can be used to counteract identified impediments to fair housing, but it can be used to establish the compelling interest needed to survive constitutional scrutiny of race-conscious housing programs. And more can be done to link affirmatively furthering fair housing and the development of specifically tailored local housing programs. And the fourth thing I'll briefly note is that the Black Lives Matter movement has, and the pandemic in the course of the recognition of broad racial discrimination and the effects of the pandemic, has made everyone sort of broadly understand systemic racism, an issue that we've been working on for the history of our movements. There's a greater popular understanding of this. And with that, there's a greater ability to apply that thinking to new innovations, including in the tech space. And we're working to identify models that can be implemented to address that systemic racism. We're working with federal regulators to harness that greater, broader understanding of systemic racism to ensure that they hold banks and other credit entities that are using AI in deploying their services and building off of data that is biased and systems that are biased to actually undo those systems and use AI to actually implement more equitable systems moving forward. And actually, federal regulators have a request for information on the use of AI and their regulatory scope that's due on June 1st. And we're collaborating with our civil rights partners to coordinate a sign-on letter. So more information on that. But these are just some of the ways that the pandemic has shifted our appreciation of systemic racism and deep inequity in a way that we could advance with the tools that we have within the fair housing movement. And with that, Stella, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for that. I very much appreciate it. And at this point in time, I'm going to ask a man that needs no introduction, Chris Brancard, who is a very proficient and successful fair housing attorney, and whose work is beyond compare. So, Chris, take it away and talk to us a little bit about what you see as our future.
Hi, I'm Chris Brancard, and thank you very much, Stella. That was a very nice introduction. And Morgan, thank you, because I think your approach, looking at it in these new frames, is helpful and it's thoughtful. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, as it were. When I was asked to think about this topic, I was sort of struck with a great ambivalence. And by that, I mean, I have great hope for our future. I do believe that over time, because I was raised in an Enlightenment Western tradition, that over time that we progress and that things do get better. But I also read a lot of history, and I also see and I understand and I appreciate that progress is not a straight line, though we do hope it bends towards justice. But I am sort of struck, having worked in fair housing now for not quite 3 decades, and having worked close to the ground, worked day in and day out on relatively small cases, investigating them, meeting the people that are affected by discriminatory housing practices. I am a bit struck that I thought we would have made more progress by now. I thought we would have made more progress by now. I mean, I'm not saying that we were going to wake up and it was going to be like the famous painting, peace on earth, and the lamb would lie down with the lion. But I am saying that I thought many of the systemic problems would be resolved, that government, all units of government, would be advocating for fair housing through the affirmatively furthering process, or through the general plan process, or through any number of governmental requirements that call upon government to advance fair housing, to increase opportunity. And I believed in that strongly, because from a strictly economic point of view, or call it, or a strictly Republican or a point of view, that one of the great strengths of the United States, one of the things that has allowed the United States to be so resilient over time, is that we've expanded opportunity more so than any other country in history. That we have broken down barriers and invited people to join the conversation and to join the economy. And because of that, we have rebounded from incredible missteps, such as the meltdown, the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. But I am also a little bit chastened by the fact that I look back at so many missed opportunities, and that, my adulthood, my full adulthood, I think about the loss back in 2000 of Gore being defeated by Bush, and what would have been, both on the issues of climate and social justice. I look back after the 8 years of President Obama, who did not perhaps push the agenda I was hoping that was going to be pressed, but did an incredibly good job. And then, of course, we see the last 4 years ending as it did, and I am left with the feeling that I need to take some of the medicine that Morgan just gave us, and to renew my optimism about the future, because I am a bit struck that we're on a precipice that we don't yet know what to do. I do agree with Morgan that the time is now, that the wonderful thing about the pandemic is, and there's nothing wonderful about disease and losing people, but the wonderful thing about the pandemic is that it affected all of us, and therefore it brought a sense of unity. Now, unfortunately, because of the political leadership at the time, that effect was used, or they tried to use it, to divide us. And that is what it was. But I do agree that, and I also think that, looking back in our recent past, that, we've made so many profound missteps. The notion that we were going to be upset about spending $1 trillion to support people because of the pandemic seemed to me to have no legs at all, because we had just spent $2 trillion blowing things up in Asia and Southeast Asia to no good end. And so at least we're focusing our resources on people that need it, and not to destructive purposes. So going back to the points that Morgan raised, I'm delighted to hear them, because I think they are the frames that we need to look at. But I also recognize that I'm not sure we're ready. I'm not sure we're prepared for what the new housing market looks like and what we as fair housing advocates need to do to ensure that there's social justice in that housing market. Just 3 examples to think about. One is last night when I was sort of struck with my ambivalence, trying to think about what to say, when I oftentimes want to divert myself, I went on YouTube and I listened to an old lecture, an old interview of a philosopher, Quine, who I don't understand. And I don't understand why he's such a big deal, because I don't understand him, because he is a big deal. But I went back and listened to him, and it was sort of so striking that in my lifetime, I now have access to all of this information, all of this data that I could never dream of when I was in college or in law school. At the same time, the ubiquity of digitized information has so changed the housing market that we as fair housing advocates, I don't think, have caught up. I don't think that we have come to totally grasp what it means to think of the housing market that we want to bring social justice to as an information market. That information market is now digitized, and once digitized, can be subject to all kinds of manipulation, for good and bad. And it seems to me that what the first thing we have to do is, since we're on this precipice of this change in the housing market, is we have to figure out what exactly does big data mean in terms of the housing market and how the algorithms affect us. The second thing I was sort of struck by was I have always lived in the world that things happened. I lived in a material world. I was a materialist, maybe a positivist. And I actually went around the world and I wanted to meet people and talk with them about their experiences. But one of the things that so struck me over the last few years is that our consciousness, our sense of right and wrong, our sense of reality has been so truncated and bounded by what we're receiving from the internet or on screens, that I'm wondering if we're missing the debate. We're missing the debate if we're not actively engaged in promoting our mission, our view, our agenda on the internet and social media platforms and things of that kind. And I would urge everyone who's involved in fair housing to really think about that in terms of what do our platforms look like, and how well we groom them and maintain them. I know Toledo has done a tremendous amount of great work in this area. I know that Marin has done some fantastic work in this area, but it's something that so struck me when I began to realize that lived reality was no longer the world that I grew up in. It was no longer a materialist world in which what do they say? The kids say, what do they say? IRL, in real life? IRL. It wasn't IRL in terms of things in materialism and things that I walked through in time and space, but it became this manufactured reality that was being handed to me by the internet. For good, I got to listen to Quine be interviewed last night and for an hour and a half. Can't say I learned much. But also for bad, right? I mean, we've seen the manipulation, of course, over the last 4 years. And then the last thing I would say that about the frames that give me hope that Morgan touched on was the notion of recognizing connectivity between what we hope to accomplish as fair housing advocates and the other problems that confront so many people. Many times in my work, just the nature of the work I do is, as I said, very close to the ground, and it deals with relatively small cases. I am dealing with individuals that are confronted with immediate needs in the form of maintaining their housing, or the condition of their housing, or obtaining a loan or some permission from some institution so they can go on and improve their lives, whether it's building affordable housing or just getting a loan to buy a house. And I'm very struck by the fact that when I approach problems as someone who does fair housing cases, I very much tend to be very siloed. And what I mean by that is I look at it from the prism of well, is there a fair housing case here? What's the evidence and things of that kind? And I think that the point Morgan was raising that was so powerful was I need to break out of that silo, because my legalistic, narrow view of the world does not resonate. It's not resonating with people. It's not resonating. What people want when they contact me is solutions to the immediate needs. And those solutions are not going to be found always in the form of a court case, but rather in the work that Morgan was outlining about working with agencies to connect what are health disparities in housing and how is it that they affect each other. What does it mean to regulate artificial intelligence in terms of the very simple rules that make up these algorithms that have such a profound disparate impact? We certainly saw the industry was very concerned about that. And it should give us cause to take a closer look when you saw the work that came out of the Trump administration's rewrite of the disparate impact rules. And so while I'm ambivalent about the future, and I sit here today, I didn't think we'd be living like with the Jetsons. I didn't think I'd have a power pack or something like that, or I'd have a microwave that, you know, you put in a block and out came a steak or something like that. I did think that we would have made more progress. And I'm chastened by the fact that we haven't. And I hope that looking at the points that the frames that Morgan has proposed, that we approach this precipice we're on, this whole radical change that's occurring in the housing market as we've moved to digitized information that's transmitted not in real life, but rather through this medium of the internet, that I hope that we are developing the tools and the strategies to address housing discrimination there, so that when we meet 5 years from now, I won't be here, but some other person will be, and they'll say, wow, we've accomplished a lot over the first administration, Biden administration, and into the Harris administration. So that's all I have, and I appreciate being here, and I appreciate what Morgan said. I really much look forward to what Mr. Green has to say and to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you bringing us into focus around what we have left to do. With that, I'm going to introduce you to Brian Green, who just won this fantastic award just the other day, like top leader in housing for the whole country. So we're pretty excited to have him with us today. I remember him when he was just a bushy-eyed little intern working in HUD. And now here he is, Man of the Year. What can I say? We are so happy to have you with us, Brian, and we're so eager to hear your vision.
Okay, well, no pressure, right, Stella? Thank you, and it's great to follow Chris Brancard and Morgan Williams and their great ideas and framework for helping us look at the future of fair housing. I sort of want to lay out a framework that I think it's time for us to prioritize, and that is. I see our focus now having to be advocating for more systemic changes overall. That fair housing advocacy should focus more on systemic change, proactive engagement, and by proactive engagement I mean that government like HUD and Department of Justice take action not just on the individual complaints, but identify outstanding discriminatory practices and proactively seek to address them, which means that they need to be funded to emphasize that kind of initiative. And then reparative justice. There is a great appetite in this country to actually not only identify past harms, but to restore people for those past harms. We know who has been harmed. We have among us today, if not the actual individuals who've been harmed by official discriminatory practices, the descendants who've been harmed and affected. And I think there's, if not a broad consensus, certainly an emerging consensus that it's time to explore some of those options. So let me just talk about a few of these. And I see opportunities for us to address these things from government, from advocacy, and from industry. So in terms of systemic changes, of course, individual complaints filed with HUD and state and local agencies must be addressed. But we know that there's so much discrimination that occurs in our country today that individuals will never really be able to identify. I can say from the real estate industry perspective that the testing that New York Newsday did opened up eyes of many in the real estate industry as to practices that were occurring in sales and real estate sales that they would not have otherwise known. Unless they were engaging in them, but that they would not have otherwise known because they did not see the two sides of the equation. And even people who might engage in some of these practices, if they have implicit biases, may not be aware that people are treating African Americans, Asians, Hispanics one way and treating whites another way. And testing, of course, is the best evidence of that. I think many in our industry have long supported fair housing and have advised consumers when they see discrimination to file a complaint, or when they experience discrimination to file a complaint. But testing illustrates that individuals don't know that they're being discriminated against because they don't have that privileged information. So it's important that fair housing groups are actively doing testing and pursuing complaints based on that. And I would say HUD should be doing more testing. HUD should be supporting testing in support of investigations and proactively working with fair housing groups to do testing for enforcement purposes. So we at the National Association of Realtors have been advocating increased budgets for HUD's enforcement work and for the private fair housing groups. In Congress right now, Cortez Masto, Senator Cortez Masto has a bill that would increase the funding. And we think that's very important. But we want to stress that that funding increase should support more testing and more proactive engagement. HUD has a systemic and secretary-initiated investigations office. We really think that office should be more active and taking a leadership role in identifying discriminatory practices and addressing them. For example, there's been a lot of news coverage about discrimination in appraisals. We think this is really significant because we all advocate more home ownership. But the concern we should all have is that people of color buy homes and then don't realize the full benefit of it. If you have a home and your home is being devalued, either because of your race or because of the racial composition of your community, you really are not getting the full American dream. You're achieving a fraction of the American dream, or I don't know. It's not quite a dream. It's like a groggy state. We want to be sure that there is no discrimination ultimately in home ownership, meaning that when you go to refinance your home or when you go to tap the equity in your home, that you achieve what you deserve. So this is a role for government to lean in and investigate these practices. It's an opportunity to bring different entities together. Another role government can take sort of takes me to sort of proactive engagement, where government can convene the real estate industry, the appraisal industry, the government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and say, we need to roll up our sleeves. Here's an example where, we have a 45% homeownership rate among African Americans. The wealth may be there, but untapped because of devalued potential, devalued appraisals. And so we should make sure that everyone who currently has a home gaining the full benefit of that. So that's something I think that would be really critical for government to engage in. In terms of other proactive engagement, I think fair housing advocates have an opportunity to highlight and address institutional discrimination, institutional racism, all kinds of structural practices that are discriminatory. Fair housing groups being in the community and working with communities on their affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations, I think have a great opportunity today, now that more and more Americans are unearthing the past of their communities. Just recently, we heard in Manhattan Beach how the city, or maybe it's the county, Los Angeles County, is actually returning to an African American family a beach that the city had taken by eminent domain, Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach. And a few generations later, but the history was known. And you actually saw county officials acknowledge that what happened was wrong, although they didn't officially apologize. They acknowledged and condemned the past practices and said, we are going to turn this land over to the family. There's perhaps more they should do because the family lost the benefit of this land for about 100 years. But that said, communities are engaging in this kind of historical analysis, and private fair housing groups who are working with communities on affirmatively furthering fair housing have an opportunity to help these communities see these examples. And I think they're the most powerful examples to begin the analysis, because a lot of people don't otherwise appreciate the starting point. And I know from the National Association of Realtors, this is a conversation we have with some members. The president of the National Association of Realtors last year apologized for the role of our association in creating and maintaining racially restrictive covenants and redlining. And while overwhelmingly our membership recognized that was important and supported that apology, we still had members who didn't understand it and viewed the past as bad actors, or the past as the past and not affecting today. And so there's a lot of education that still must be done. But to be able to point to specific acts, specific practices, specific stories, I think helps with that conversation. There are private groups who are calling attention to the impact of racially restrictive covenants in their communities. I think that's helpful. There's the Mapping Prejudice Project out of Minneapolis. There's another one also out of Minnesota called Just Deeds that is showing the impact of those past, now unenforceable deeds on our communities today. So all of that history, I think, draws a clear line that people can understand, so as we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, they can appreciate why it's still necessary today, what the impact is. And I think because there is perhaps a minority, but a vocal minority of people who are pushing back or who don't understand the systemic nature of discrimination and how it continues despite changes in law. And I think it's important to tell those stories and to draw that line for people, especially if you're trying to do advocacy and influence decision-making at the local level. And along those same lines, I want to talk about reparative justice. In a sense, what I described with Manhattan Beach is an example, but there are cities, communities across the nation, really in the last couple of years, who are recognizing an opportunity to begin leveling the playing field by helping those families who were harmed by discriminatory practices over the past century. So one great example, Evanston, Illinois. they decided that they were going to compensate families whose descendants of families who were harmed by that city's discriminatory practices, that city's segregative practices, which limited African American families to a small triangular area of the city between 1919 and 1969. And I think this is perhaps a model for others to think about. It's conservative, but at the same time, I think very logical that they recognize the city's official actions to redline and to confine people to certain blocks based on race. And they said that, during this period, we committed these actions, and anyone who is a descendant of anyone who was limited to those blocks now would be entitled to this new fund that they created, using the taxes on marijuana sales. So a new fund. It wasn't diverting money from existing city funds, but they said, we're creating a fund and we're going to give this to descendants, and this is an effort to acknowledge the harm that was caused. Now, it's very modest, but legally, I think they were very careful to create a program that could withstand challenge. And so others may look to this and may get more bold, but to recognize this can be done and may be appropriate in different cities. I know Asheville, North Carolina is looking at the impact of urban renewal on that community. And so as fair housing advocates and others do assessments of fair housing in a community, I think this is a very important part of the history where people saw the loss of their homes and businesses without due compensation. And of course, this included infrastructural decisions too. Great NPR story just this past weekend, just about how all this played out in Los Angeles. So there's an opportunity for, I think, a diverse set of actors to weigh in on all of these things and identify how some of these systemic practices are still leaving many behind, and the need for us to look at our housing finance systems, for example, and how they may still disadvantage people. What we may be overlooking sometimes in how they disadvantage people. So I do think this is a great opportunity for us. As Chris said, unfortunately, I think COVID in a way, it was necessary to highlight these things, which is sad. But I think that's going to be the nature of things, that we are going to have these situations. And again, we're going to discover how they disproportionately affect certain populations because of our history. And so when those lessons are presented to us, we should follow up. So I want to thank you for your time, and I really appreciate being part of this august group.
Thank you so much, Brian. And I just want to thank all of our panelists who have done an extraordinary job. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to ask you some questions, and hopefully we can generate a little conversation amongst ourselves. And then in the final 10 minutes, we will answer questions from our audience. But the first question I want to pose to you is, how can we work together across as civil rights and fair housing and community health advocates? How can we work together, leverage our resources to attack fair housing issues?
I know my colleagues on the panel will have thoughts. Just two quick thoughts. I mean, I think it's a top down and it's a bottom up. And at the federal level, there is a directive that has been given to HUD and federal agencies to account for the extent to which systemic racism has been perpetrated by the federal government, federal agencies, agency by agency. And there needs to be coordination in that assessment. And I think there's an opportunity for the CDC and HUD and other agencies that are involved in this engagement to look at how to coordinate those planning processes moving forward. But then from the ground up, we all are the local leaders in our communities that can provide information to our cities, to our local housing departments that are charged with carrying out whatever fair housing planning unfolds in this new regime. And that leadership is something that needs to bring in local health officials to the conversation and ensure those planning processes are coordinated for local level.
And Brian, I'm going to come to you next because you can talk a little bit from your past experience about how that internal federal coordination does or doesn't work, and what we can look forward to in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so I really think that what helps influence government is really what happens outside, and it's really people banding together to press a case. And I think we have a great opportunity right now because many in the housing industry and the fair housing community are seeing some alignment of their interests. Morgan can tell you the Mortgage Bankers Association and the National Fair Housing Alliance are working together on major initiatives and proposals and finding common cause. Likewise, we're working with National Fair Housing Alliance and a group of industry advocates and fair housing advocates on the Black Homeownership Collaborative, a recognition that that's housing homeownership for people of color is going to be necessary to keep growing our economy. The 75% home ownership rate among whites may not go much higher. We're not going to have everyone owning homes, but when we have these differentials, if we want to see our economy expand, we're going to have to identify those barriers and address those barriers for people of color. And more and more, we're seeing the data come out from various think tanks and economists just on how much money America loses by not addressing both segregation and these inequities. And now, the White House is actually using some of that data. So the more I think we outside of government are in lockstep on this and sending coalition letters, joining together on different collaboratives, I think that will make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm.
Chris, this is supposed to be a conversation. I shouldn't have to call on y'all.
Yeah, well, and I can see that Brian and Morgan have muted themselves, which leaves me like a lone man in a lifeboat. I just want to echo what Brian and Morgan said, and I will say one of the things that strikes me, as I say, working on cases close to the ground and locally, is that we have not done a very good job of building bridges to the industry as well as to local government. And what I mean by that is this: we rarely take advantage of the opportunities to comment and to speak to things such as general plan revisions or affirmatively furthering fair housing opportunities or CDBG hearings. And I know, because being in local government at different times, but also suing a lot of local governments, I see what's in these files, and I'm surprised at the scarcity of comments by fair housing advocates. So one thing I think we need to do is we need to take advantage of the opportunities that are there. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we need to build bridges, and Brian's alluded to this, and Morgan by bringing in the health disparities. We need to build bridges to people in the industry. So for example, Morgan and Brian spoke about discrimination potentially in the appraisal of housing. We are working on one such case. And the first thing I wanted to know was, can we call an appraiser who is, they don't have to be like a fellow traveler or anything like that, but do we know an appraiser that we can call just to say, hey, this is a gut check. Does this look strange to you? And no one really knew an appraiser that we could call. There's a reason we got to build those bridges. That's one thing, so that we can have those experts that we can go to. And I'm sure Brian can help us connect with some of those folks. Here's the second thing I want to say. We complain a lot to government when it does things wrong. But I think as social advocates, as social beings, we need to honor government when it does things right. Okay? So when and I think we're in for some good things with the Biden administration. I think they've put some great people in the right places. Now, when they do things that are right, we need to reach out to them and say, hey, this was a great thing you did. We support you on this. And by the way, we got your back when people start pushing against what you're trying to do, whether it be the new AFH, the affirmatively further regulation, or the re-rate on disparate impact. We've got your back and we appreciate what you're doing. We need to have that conversation going both ways, so that every time we pick up the phone, it isn't like, what have you screwed up this time? It's like, hey, I'll call you and tell you when you screw up, but I want to tell you, I really appreciate what you did in this recent rule or vote or whatever, and we're there and we got you. So I'd like to see us build that conversation more, because I'll leave it at that.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about, Chris, I agree with you about engagement at the local level in building a record at CDBG hearings, consolidated planning hearings, transit hearings. Now I know I have to also go to some kind of health meeting I didn't know I had to go to. But I can tell you that and in my retired state, I have been engaged at home. And here's kind of the way these things go. The public hearing for the CDBG program the hearing was announced December the 23rd for a hearing on January 4th. And in the meantime, they said the hearing was for the annual plan. Did they put a copy of the plan out for me to review? No. If I didn't know what an annual plan was, and most community members don't, and there's nothing there that tells me this is where I go to ask for sidewalks and infrastructure and support for my neighborhood and affordable housing. If I don't know that, right, one, would I be paying attention on December the 23rd? Not even the advocates paid attention. And January 4th was the first day back to work. But they technically met the criteria of a 10-day notice. Now, I caught it, and I got 6 people to complain, and we had them hold an extra meeting because the law requires 2. But we'll be nice to y'all and give y'all a 3rd meeting. And so they gave us the meeting. There were 25 folks who submitted comments at the public hearing. There was a forum in February where community organizations all across the city came. We get to the hearing on March and we give our data, and then the final hearing is on April 19th. And not a damn thing is changed. Not one. And so when we complained about it, they went, oh, you were in the wrong hearings. You were at the consolidated planning hearings. You should have been at the comprehensive planning hearings. And about that bus route, you needed to be part of the transit planning hearings. Now, you come from a low income neighborhood and you are standing in a ditch waiting for the bus stop. You have your taxes have gone up 300% versus white neighborhoods that have gone on 26%. But you're supposed to figure out which public hearing you're supposed to be in. And even if you can figure it out, how much money are you expected to lose in wages to attend all these meetings? And so, it's incumbent upon us to figure out a way to work together, to leverage and take pieces of this and respond. I am at wit's end. I get away with a lot because, it's me. But if you're a neighborhood person trying to get betterment for your neighborhood and you go to all these meetings and at the last one they go, oops, did we forget to tell you needed to be somewhere else? Most of the community groups are so deflated that they don't try again. And that's and then is that where I need to call you, Chris?
I'm just going to make one observation, and it goes back to this notion that maybe our reality has shifted. It seems to me that one of the things as fair housing advocates is we have to go back and be better community organizers. And that means that we have got to be the folks that build the, if you will, the entry ramps into these proceedings so that people know what hearing to go to. And I think we have to be sort of, if you will, translators. I also think, again, it goes back, we have to build allies. There are allies in the government. There are allies in business. And it's those allies. And I hate to say that we have to circumvent a bureaucracy to go ahead and get the truth, but sometimes a phone call to an ally in local government to say, hey, what's really going on? Or who do we need to talk to can make a huge difference. We need to be putting resources into building those bridges, I think, so that we have those allies in the future.
And just to this point, for advocates who want some more background information on things like the consolidated planning process and how it should work, the National Low Income Housing Coalition has a great guide that, for example, page 7-29 starts a good review of the consolidated planning process and how it should work. So when jurisdictions inevitably don't necessarily do what they should, as Stella outlined, in myriad ways, you can use that to challenge them to do it right.
Brian, what do you think? How can the NAR, the local realtors, assist us in these processes?
Well, many associations and private fair housing groups just never talk. And I'm always surprised, and I come obviously to NAR from HUD, and sometimes there's just, sometimes I think there's fear, and sometimes there's just, I don't know, lack of knowledge of who's out there and who's doing what. And so I'm constantly trying to bring these groups together because they have a resource in their community. They don't need to call me all the time on fair housing matters. And then two, there's a lot that they can do together. So, for example, there's a group formed this past year, a Facebook group called Real Estate Professionals Against Racism. And they're having great conversations on a wide variety of topics. There's so many topics that they're raising where private fair housing groups would probably want to join and be part of that conversation, but they don't necessarily know them in their community. And so they call me and then I identify the groups. But, if people knew them, there's a lot that they could be doing together. And I think that's sort of important for the fair housing community to appreciate too, that, you may think of the National Association of Realtors as a monolith. We're 1.4 million members. And so we actually are a great cross-section of the American people. And many of the issues that you're raising or concerned about, individuals within the real estate profession are also concerned about, and forming conversations and initiatives. So there's just lots of opportunity for people to link up. So yeah, so I'll certainly do all that I can to build those bridges. But I encourage fair housing groups to reach out to local and state real estate associations as well.
Brian and Morgan, and for you as well, Chris. There's a lot of concern going on about what do they call them, pocket sales, where nothing goes out. It's a private, that somehow it's a private transaction, um, and the house never goes on the market, or it can only be sold to people within the same, shown and sold to people within the same um, office. We're very concerned. This goes back to the way the old ancient MLS used to work. Um, and how, and if you have these sales, how does that, how do we break through that? Um, and bring about, make sure that the market is operating in a fair way.
So you're absolutely right. This is a concern within the industry, and NAR has also said that transparency is key. And the very issue you raise of exclusivity, while there are many in the industry who see this as an opportunity for a company to offer special exclusive opportunities in a tight market to their network and their client base. The National Association of Realtors has pointed out that this could also perpetuate segregation. If you don't have a client base that includes a diverse group of people, if you don't put these listings out in the multiple listing services where everyone can see them, it could perpetuate segregation. So that is a problem. And I think insofar as fair housing groups are concerned about this as well, it's an opportunity for us to come together and figure out what kind of policy could help change this. But I mean, we as the National Association of Realtors have discouraged this practice.
And that just to note, that leadership and that express policy discouraging this is really what we needed to communicate strongly to the industry that it needs to stop, and to provide that leadership within the industry to stop it. Pocket listings does pose that concern that Brian noted that we share deeply. It's also an issue that can be difficult to enforce. And so the leadership from NAR on this in the past couple of years has been profound and much needed, and just applaud that.
Do we have, Chris, is there any way that we can utilize the provisions of the Fair Housing Act around the MLS service to perhaps attack this market if we see that if we can identify census tracts or communities that appear to either be altered, becoming more segregated, or is, what kind of things can you imagine that we as investigators need to be looking for to collect the evidence? I'm assuming we'd have to use the provision of the law related to the MLS to attack it. Am I in the wrong place?
No, I think you are in the right place. And I think that one of the most underutilized provisions of the Fair Housing Act was the discriminatory housing practice identified in 3606, which was originally designed to deal with the brokerage of housing in the context of MLS, where there were many abuses back in the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, in terms of how MLS manipulated access to information about the housing market. And I say it's underutilized because I do think it's a tool, and I know I've spoken with fair housing lawyers about this, Morgan and I have spoken about it. I do think it is a tool that gives us a way to expand its application and reach into new information markets in the form of digitized information, web advertisement, and things like that. The challenge, of course, becomes getting access to the data. And once we get access to the data, the next challenge is how do we go ahead and analyze that data to determine where there might be a problem? And then equally important, how do we present that data and who do we present it to? Going back to something I said in the very beginning, which is oftentimes because I'm a lawyer and I have this siloed view of the world, my thinking is, well, we should bring a court case. But I'm increasingly, as I get older, coming to realize that that is a very weak remedy if we want to accomplish social change. And I think we need to be thinking more about when we do these studies and presenting the information to bringing it to stakeholders in local government or in our state government, or in, now that we have an administration that will listen, to the federal government. And I'll just put this one point to this, just to go to this one point. In California, during the Trump administration, we were very frustrated that there were very few policies coming out of Washington that we thought were productive. In fact, most were counterproductive. And it is amazing to see what the California legislature did, because of a lot of very skilled advocates in California, to do things like adopting an affirmatively furthering for housing program during the Trump administration that actually has teeth, that's actually targeting discriminatory practices by local jurisdictions in a way that's never happened before. So going back to your question, I think we need to dust off Section 3606. I think we need to start looking at how do we collect the data that reflects what's going on in the housing market and analyze it, but who do we then present it to? So those are my thoughts.
Thank you all. Are there, Jake, are you seeing any questions from others that we might address?
Unfortunately, this channel is needed for a 1 o'clock session.
All right. Well, thank y'all so much for your participation. I appreciate every single one of you. And I'm sorry, I am looking at the clock, and we have, all you got to do is say goodbye, because that's all we got time for. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, everyone. You're troopers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.